Okay, let's dive into this. Have you ever felt this just profound, almost unexplainable sense of isolation? Like no matter how close you get to someone, there's this invisible, totally uncrossable barrier between you. Well, in today's Explainer, we're exploring the work of the mid-20th century French philosopher Georges Bataille and his absolutely fascinating and honestly sometimes terrifying theory of inner experience. Bataille looked at that deep existential mystery of human isolation and asked a really dangerous question. What if our deepest desire actually isn't to preserve ourselves, but to completely shatter that barrier and just lose ourselves entirely?
Don't worry, even though this is complex mid-century French philosophy, we've got a really clear roadmap for this journey of the self. We'll start with the burden of discontinuity, then we'll look at how eroticism and death fit into continuity. After that, we'll define what Bataille actually means by the inner experience, explore this radical idea of a consciousness of nothing, and finally wrap up with what it means to be lost without being found.
So let's kick things off with Section 1, the burden of discontinuity. We really have to start here to understand the universal, painful problem of human existence according to Bataille.
To understand Bataille's whole philosophical architecture, we've got to look at what he saw as our universal problem. He defines us as discontinuous beings. So what does that actually mean? Basically, it means you and I are individuals who exist completely separate, distinct, and isolated from one another. We're separated by this unbridgeable gulf. As Bataille pretty bluntly puts it, if you die, it's not my death, right? You can listen to me right now, we can try our best to communicate, but no amount of talking can abolish our fundamental physical and mental separation. We are literally trapped in our own distinct bodies and minds. And for Bataille, this isolation breeds a very specific kind of anguish.
And this brilliantly illustrates the core tension in Bataille's thought, the clash between discontinuity and continuity. On the one hand, we've got the world of discontinuity. This is just our daily life. It's the world of isolation, going to work, making tools, and really just obsessing over the survival of our precarious little individual selves. But on the other side, we have continuity. This is the realm of the sacred. It's eroticism, the fusion of beings, and ultimately, it's death. Bataille argues that even though we live in this prison of daily isolation, we actually possess this innate, almost dangerous yearning to merge back into the continuity of general existence. We desperately long to bridge that unbridgeable gulf.
Which brings us to Section 2, eroticism, death, and continuity. Let's look at the physical ways we actually try to shatter that isolation.
So how do human beings physically attempt to escape this prison of discontinuity? How do we try to break out? Well, Bataille looks to a rather extreme source to make his point, quoting the Marquis de Sade, who said, "There is no better way to know death than to link it with some licentious image." Now that is a really striking paradox. Why on earth would you link eroticism with death? Well, because for Bataille, physical eroticism is fundamentally an attempt to violate our isolated, discontinuous beings. In the sheer violence and intensity of erotic passion, we're basically trying to momentarily shatter our personal boundaries and return to a state of continuity with another person.
To kind of ground this idea, Bataille walks us through a pretty visceral biological analogy, cellular reproduction. Step 1, you have a sperm and an ovum, and they exist as completely disconnected, separate entities, right? Then, Step 2, they unite and fuse together. And finally, Step 3, a totally new entity forms. But pay attention to what happens here. For that fusion to actually occur, for that moment of continuity to exist, the original separate cells essentially have to die. Their individual boundaries are completely destroyed. So new life and the continuity it represents absolutely requires the violent death and fusion of isolated elements.
And this leads us straight to Bataille's core thesis here. Eroticism is assenting to life even in death. Physical eroticism is a profound challenge to death. Why? Because in the throes of erotic passion, that heady rush of continuity, that desperate feeling of merging with someone else, it actually becomes more powerful than the fear of death itself. For that one fleeting moment, we prioritize the intoxicating feeling of continuity over the safe, mundane survival of our discontinuous selves. We're literally willing to let our individual boundaries die just a little bit so we can feel connected to the whole.
Moving from the physical realm to the metaphysical, we arrive at Section 3, defining the inner experience.
The thing is, physical eroticism is only temporary. So we're left with this really pivotal question. How do we reach continuity without physical destruction? I mean, if true continuity means the actual death of our discontinuous selves, how can we experience it without, literally dying? This is exactly where Bataille introduces his concept of the inner experience. It's essentially a psychological and mental escape from our isolation.
Bataille defines this inner experience in a very specific way. He calls it a mystical experience, but without a god. See, Bataille was deeply influenced by 13th century mystics, people who wrote about the soul fusing with the divine. He absolutely recognized the profound psychological reality of their experiences, that incredible feeling of the self just dissolving into a vast continuum. But because he was writing what he considered an atheological summa, which is basically a theology of godlessness, Bataille completely strips away the traditional concept of a personal god. So in his view, there's no benevolent creator waiting to catch you, there's only the vast, overwhelming continuity of existence itself.
So, the crucial point is, how do you actually have a mystical experience without theology? Well, by engaging in this radical practice of unknowing. This involves totally rejecting the accumulation of knowledge, because our daily life is all about building up facts, right? Securing our identity. But inner experience is the exact opposite. It's about embracing unreason, just staring out into the outside or the unknown. Bataille frequently uses this really visceral imagery of tearing or wounding, like a literal psychological laceration of our personal integrity. It's all about reaching a state of pure expenditure, where you're just burning up your own consciousness without trying to gain absolutely anything in return.
This brings us to the climax of Bataille's ontology. Section 4, a consciousness of nothing.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how inner experience demands that human consciousness turns entirely away from the material, useful world. To bridge that gulf of discontinuity we talked about, consciousness has to stare into what Bataille brilliantly calls the dark incandescence of the unknown. Basically, to achieve inner experience, your consciousness has to stop looking at distinct objects. Think about it. Normally, our minds are always focused on something, right? A tool, a problem, a person at the grocery store. But to bridge the gulf of discontinuity, you must stare into an absolute void. It's intellectual contemplation, but entirely without shape or form.
Let's actually contrast these two states to make it a bit clearer. First, we have object consciousness. This is our default mode. We grasp objects, we accumulate knowledge, we're constantly seeking stability and meaning. But then, we have what Bataille calls the consciousness of nothing. This is pure interiority. It's defined almost entirely by negation. It isn't about finding enlightenment or accumulating facts or saving your soul. It is consciousness as a sacrifice. It's a sovereign lucidity where thought itself just becomes this process of expenditure. It's a quiet, terrifying awareness of absolute loss and formlessness. It's a consciousness that literally has nothing as its object.
And finally, we arrive at the paradoxical conclusion of this philosophy. Section 5, lost without being found.
So what does this radical inner experience actually achieve for the individual who pursues it? The answer is perfectly captured in this chilling yet honestly beautiful quote from Bataille: "The desire only to be lost without being found." Just let that sink in for a second. In traditional religious mysticism, you lose your individual self to be found in the warm, protective embrace of God. It's a transaction, right? One that ultimately secures your safety. But Bataille's continuity offers absolutely no safety net. The true, sovereign individual desires to be completely immersed in the continuous unknown, with zero guarantee of ever returning intact. Let's move on and see how this builds, because ultimately, true sovereignty for Bataille requires rejecting any return to that safe, accumulated self. It is the conscious experience of nothing. Borrowing again from those 13th century mystics, it's the feeling of dying because I do not die, just a continuous tearing open of our protective boundaries. True sovereignty is the radical, terrifying willingness to completely surrender your individuality and just immerse yourself in nature's incessant process of loss and expenditure. You aren't saved, you are spent.
So, as we wrap up this explainer on Bataille, I want to leave you with this haunting existential prompt. Are you prepared to lose yourself, along with the rest of the world, in the dark incandescence of the unknown? It really forces us to look at the walls we've built around our isolated lives and question whether our deepest, most secret desire isn't actually to just tear them all down. Think about that the next time you feel separated from the world around you. Thanks for exploring this incredible theory with me.